So thank you very much to our next speaker, Emily. Emily Whitehead will be presenting Pastiche, Making a Place for Modified Funerary Models. This is a topic very, very close to my heart. This is a rabbit hole I have fallen down feet first and I'm absolutely loving. So really, really looking forward to this presentation. Emily is a PhD candidate in the Department of Art, Emory, at the university with the 2024 to 27 David E. Finley Fellow at the Center of Advanced Study in the Visual Arts, National Gallery of Art, Washington, D.C. She has previously been the Nat C. Robertson Graduate Fellow in the Science and Society at the Institute for Liberal Arts at Emory University, and she also held the Andrew W. Mellon Fellowship in Object-Centered Curatorial Research. Her research interests focus on Middle Kingdom funerary art, archaeology, and texts, as well as the formation of narratives and arguments surrounding continuity and change in burial practices. Her PhD dissertation is entitled Variance and Innovation in Middle Kingdom Coffins at a Time of Standardization and Homogeneity. She received her Masters of Arts in Ancient History with first-class honours from the University of Auckland. Thank you so much, Emily.
Thank you so much, Sam, and thank you for organising this excellent opportunity to discuss funerary models and inviting me to share this paper, which stems from an object-centered project begun in 2020 on a heavily modified solar boat model, which came into the Michael C. Carlos Museum at Emory University in Atlanta in 2018. Through studying this boat, I came across the frequent use of the word pastiche to refer to a range of different funerary models. The term pastiche likely derives from Italian for a pie or a pate, which was a hodgepodge of ingredients and was also used to refer to an artwork that combined several different styles. It implied an artwork was a mess, that it was of a lower order, and could even denote fraudulence. However, the earliest French usage of pastiche was applied to artworks that can neither be called originals nor copies, constituting a more neutral or even in some cases positive use of the term. Pastiche is generally utilized in Egyptological scholarship to designate an artwork made up of parts drawn together from various sources. Funerary models that have been modified are relatively common. Some modifications are quite minimal, while others have undergone more significant changes. Some combine several models or even modern and ancient components to create a new funerary model. The combined models with known archaeological contexts are generally still included in Egyptological studies and are somewhat infrequently referred to as pastiche. In contrast, those modified and combined, presumably for sale by dealers, or that are a mixture of ancient or more modern components, are classified as pastiche and are often ignored or excluded as not useful for our Egyptological studies. Pastiches being nearly synonymous with fraudulence, fakes, and copies impacts how objects that have been deemed pastiches have previously been viewed in Egyptological scholarship and why pastiches are generally excluded. In this presentation, I wish to explore whether pastiche remains a useful term in ancient Egyptian art and how we might usefully engage with modified or pastiche funerary models. And to do this, I'm going to return to this case study of the Michael C. Carlos model solar boat, which for ease today, I am going to refer to as the Carlos boat. From 2020 to 2022, Caitlin Wright, the Advanced Objects Conservation Fellow at the Carlos Museum, and now at the Field Museum in Chicago, and I undertook a range of analyses of this boat. And here's an image of us very early on in the project in 2020. These analyses included CT scanning and portable X-ray fluorescence spectrometry, the results of which I'm going to touch on as I go through today. Solar boat models, which the Carlos boat has been designated, are extremely rare, and they share a very particular set of furniture. Perhaps most importantly, in our case here today, they lack a crew, unlike this crowded deck with 12 human figures that we see here. Model solar boats, as seen in this example from Deir el-Bersha, generally have a bow with a striped cover, which you can see the cover has been placed here towards the stern on the image. A board with ma'at feathers, 3 rectangular boxes and a cylinder with posts protruding and several falcons attached, and finally an upturned stern finial. Some of these features are found on the Carlos vessel. The bow has a striped cover, like that seen on the Bersha boat. At the stern, we have a rectangular box whose painted decoration with vertical orange, cream, and black stripes corresponds to the decoration of the box towards the stern on the Bersha boat. On top of that box, there is a bird which has the facial features of a falcon. XRF elemental analysis of the small amount of pigment remaining on that bird found arsenic. So it was quite possibly painted in yellow orpiment, which would correspond with the yellow falcons that have been found on other solar barks, which have been indicated here with those 2 red lines. From just looking at the boat, we knew at least part of it was a solar boat model. Still, we wanted to confirm that the hull was also part of a solar boat, and to examine the human figures and mast to try and determine where they came from and whether they were in fact ancient. In 2021, Emory University Hospital's radiology department produced a CT scan of the vessel for us, a video of which has been playing on the screen as I've been speaking. This sample slice from the stern of the boat shows the type of information that we got from the CT scan. We can see a leg secured into a hole with a square profile with fill material. This is this bright white on the screen around it, and next to it 2 smaller voids covered over with the same fill material. The use of fill in this way would not have been expected in an ancient construction. Additionally, the hole for the leg being so much larger and this square profile with the ghost of a point of a drill bit is more in keeping with a more modern construction. In the ancient construction, we would expect these smaller holes that are tension fit without this extensive use of fill. The 2 smaller voids are in keeping with this, therefore we've interpreted them as ancient dowel holes that have since been covered over. We identified quite a number of these, which are mapped on these diagrams. In green are all the covered over ancient dowel holes, and in orange there are 2 leg holes that we presume had been drilled over the top of an ancient dowel. These all correspond to holes that we would expect to secure furniture on a solar boat. So we were able to confirm that we were looking at an ancient solar boat model with a mast and 12 figures attached in more modern times. We also had several findings regarding the solar boat furniture. I'd like to draw your attention to the falcon and the striped bow in particular. From the extant examples of model solar boats, we assumed that firstly, the bird had originally been located either on its back towards the bow or on the cylindrical object at the center, as with the Deir el-Bersha examples. And secondly, that the bow had been constructed in 2 parts with a removable cover, with several covered over holes that would have been used to attach sticks to the top of the bow cover. From the CT scan, we could see that the bird had an original dowel securing it to the center of the box it was sitting upon. So we believe that the bird is in its original location and would have sat on this orange and white striped box placed slightly further towards the center of the boat. At the bow, we were surprised to discover that it was one piece of wood and that there are no holes in the top of the cover for the posts that we saw on the Deir al-Bersha examples. These are two differences in construction that I'll return to in just a moment. As well as recognizing that the human figures were added in more modern times, we believe in the late 19th, perhaps even the early 20th century, we could see the modifications made to these figures. Metal pins were found in every arm that a wooden dowel would have originally attached. We can see two here in this shoulder. In some cases, we also found a previous dowel hole visible in either the shoulder or the arm itself, which suggested that in all likelihood, these figures were ancient. We believe that these 10 standing figures likely came from model sailing boats, as that's where standing figures like this are perhaps the most plentiful. With figures at this size, we would see at most 5 or 6 standing figures on one vessel, so at least 2 additional sailing boats were used to create the Carlos model. The 2 kneeling figures are somewhat unusual. They have one arm across their chests and one down at their sides. And the similar gesture is seen on one of the sailing boats from the tomb of Mekhet. This pose has been understood as a gesture of adoration towards the deceased, and this could suggest that the 2 kneeling figures were near an image of the deceased within the model. In such a case, some of the standing figures, kneeling figures, and even the mast could have all come from a vessel carrying an image of the deceased. So we're looking at least 2 sailing vessels and a solar boat being used to create the Carlos boat. Now, it would be impossible to study every pastiche model with such intensive technical studies. However, some of the findings regarding the ancient construction can be extrapolated to other funerary models to a limited extent, especially for solar boats in this case. There are so few known extant solar boat models. We have 2 excavated examples from Deir al-Bersha and 2 from Lisht. One of each is on the left side of the screen here. I should note that the Lisht vessels' hulls were not excavated as they were too deteriorated, so those hulls are themselves reconstructions. There are 3 pastiche solar boats, including the Carlos solar boat, one in the Egyptian Museum in Cairo, which I unfortunately do not have an image of, and one in the Rosicrucian Egyptian Museum, which I'm going to be referring to as REM for this talk. There's also a selection of solar boat furniture that's in the Egyptian Museum in Cairo. Comparatively, this is a small number of examples, and by studying the Carlos boat, we can add to what we can say about their construction. For example, we can note the very different construction of the bows at Lisht compared to Bersha. The REM and Carlos boats' bows share the most in common with the Bersha boat. In the example from Deir al-Bersha, we can see that they're made of 2 pieces, the bow finial and a striped cover. The bow finial in the Deir al-Bersha examples was also painted yellow rather than the black with the white central stripe on the Carlos and REM boats. The black and white stripe does, however, resemble the pattern on the stern finial of the Deir al-Bersha solar boat. Anne Merriman, in her extensive study of these model boats, posited that the stern finial of the REM boat model could have possibly been cut to the bow finial's size and shape, with the bow cover then attached. However, now that we can draw from the Carlos boat's findings that the bow was made of one piece of wood, And we also noted that there was no evidence of overpainting of that black and white pattern. We can argue that the construction and the paint pattern of the Carlos boat were original to the solar boat. From a close look at the REM boat, particularly a visible repaired break in the bow that goes through both the cover and the finial, it seems plausible to conclude that it was also one piece of wood, like the Carlos boat, rather than a modified stern with bow cover attached. This might suggest that the REM and Carlos boats may have a shared source for their solar boat elements. The findings surrounding the Carlos Falcon also lean towards a shared origin of the REM and Carlos boats. While the REM boat model does not currently have a falcon on the stern box, in an image of the vessel when it was sold in 1922 from the McGregor collection, a falcon was present in the same location. The finding that the Carlos Falcon had an intact ancient dowel attaching it to the striped box suggests that this placement of the bird and the black and white painted single-piece bow shared between the REM and Carlos solar boat could potentially be a shared regional variation, and just adds to our knowledge of the variation in solar boat model construction. Now, what can this case study tell us beyond just solar boat models? The main contribution, and where I believe there's the greater space for discussion and incorporation of pastiche models, is in what they tell us about the context in which they were turned into a pastiche, what they can tell us of the interpretation of models in ancient Egyptian art, what was valued on the art market by museums and private collectors alike, and what was expected of an Egyptian funerary model. As Georgia Barker, who we've heard from, discussed in her excellent 2022 book, these models were highly prized for museum collections, particularly as complete sculptures. She points to Margaret Sitko's research on the archival material from Petrie's sediment excavations, which includes a fascinating interchange between Petrie's and Ipswich Museum. From this research, we have an indication of the values of various types of models in 1920 and the pressure on archaeologists and others to produce complete sculptures. The value of boats, for example, were between 10 and 20 pounds, which is roughly 370 to 750 pounds today. When the REM vessel was sold in 1922, it reportedly sold for 51 pounds. And when it sold again in 1940, it sold for 40 pounds, both times a significant sum. The study of these pastiche vessels can expand our knowledge of what was valued in these models. These two vessels alone highlight the importance and value of human figures. In both cases, there are far more human figures than one would expect on an ancient boat model of this size and scale. On the REM boat model, several human figures are from a granary model. Human figures undertaking the hauling of grain, as far as I'm aware, have not been found on vessels from this period outside of pastiche funerary models. The emphasis instead seems to be on the need for human figures to complete these objects and therefore increase their value. This emphasis on human figures is also stressed in the letters exchanged between Ipswich Museum and Petrie, where funerary models are occasionally termed figure groups. As we're about to hear from Runa Nayord, there's also an emphasis on human figures in the interpretations of funerary models in the late 19th and early 20th century, with human figures envisaged as being inhabited and enlivened by spirits to work for and provide food, drink, and transportation to the deceased in the afterlife. This emphasis on human figures and their necessity in this interpretive framework meant that a solar boat model without human figures such as the Carlos and REM boats before their construction into pastiche models, were incomplete and likely less valuable. We can extrapolate this idea to those models found during official excavations. Many of these excavators were under pressure to provide complete funerary models to excavation committees and donors, leading to figures and elements from one model or found separate and loose being relocated to another. Stepping away from solar boats and looking at another pastiche boat model now housed in the Manchester Museum, purchased from Egypt in 1895, 1896, we can also see a focus on human figures. There's also a sense of balance in the composition. There's not an exact symmetry, but the rowing taking place at one end with the deceased atop a coffin surrounded by female figures more towards the other, and a figure at the bow roughly the same height as the stern rudder post at the back of the boat, create a balanced composition for which ancient Egyptian art was and is well known. There's a similar emphasis on balance in the composition of the Carlos and REM boats, with two finials at each end, human figures at each end facing inwards, and the balance of activities happening on either side of the mast or the canopy in the case of the REM boat model. Significant attention is being paid to balance. Neither the Carlos nor the REM boats mimic existing boat models, and the narrative of the boat's activities are difficult to deduce. In the case of the Manchester boat, the activities and narrative of the human figures are more apparent, but there are still more figures than would be expected for these activities, especially with the number of female figures around the body and the coffin. In the Carlos boat, there are 10 men, all standing directed inwards towards the mast. At most, 4 of them could be understood to be working the now non-existent rigging, but the question remains as to the 6 others and the 2 kneeling figures. In the REM boat model, the granary figures haul grain, but it's unclear where from, nor to, nor the purpose of moving those sacks of grain on board. 4 human figures sit around a canopy with a box beneath, in a way that you would expect with a funerary boat model. However, the box beneath is a canopy from a smaller vessel, rather than being a coffin or a funerary bier with a mummiform figure, as one might expect. If we have an idea of the time that the models were modified, we can also discuss what was being observed in the contemporary world around them. In the case of the REM, Carlos, and Manchester boats, we know this to be roughly the late 1800s. These examples with numerous figures can be compared to the more labor-intensive ships used during the late 19th century. Commercial and passenger-faring sea vessels, such as these seen in the port in the Suez Canal, required a large crew for rigging. It would not have been unusual to also see porters transporting goods in sacks on these vessels, or even the smaller riverine vessels on the Nile, much like the granary workers we see depicted on the REM boat model. Such ships and activities in port may have been familiar to the pastiche maker, whether in life, images, or fiction, and could have influenced the creation of these pastiche vessels. In these cases, we see that the value was placed on objects with attributes of ancient Egyptian art more broadly, in the form of balance, and funerary models specifically with human figures, not on replicating known ancient boat models. The emphasis on producing the attributes of ancient Egyptian art using ancient components, but producing something that does not replicate any known ancient object, could also suggest a value placed on unique objects. Which leads me to this fascinating model now in the World Museum here in Liverpool. The configuration that it currently has is dated to before 1850, And the model has been identified as likely the work of Joseph Sams, the collector, which puts it in a rather distinctive position of being combined by a collector, and we know potentially who. Comparisons have been drawn to the British Museum funerary boat, one of the few funerary models like this in the United Kingdom before 1850. The World Museum bear or boat is, however, unparalleled in terms of an ancient, unmodified funerary model. I also haven't seen anything quite like it amongst the pastiches. However, I have seen similarly unusual combinations of ancient Egyptian elements to create something unique, which suggests to me that the art market too was having an impact here. Just as a one-of-a-kind painting is far more valuable than a print, perhaps having something unique was more valuable than having something true to an ancient model or even a copy of another funerary model. This example being so far removed from what we're familiar with today with funerary models also reinforces my point about looking at the context of those modifying funerary models, particularly with regards to timing. With this model modified so early, when there weren't many publications of funerary models, nor access to them in many museums, we can see changes in the way that ancient Egyptian objects were perceived and the impact the proliferation of models in collection has on the perception of funerary models. Now, I am very aware that I have only spoken about boats and boat adjacent models, which honestly just betrays my interest in them. However, I wanted to step back further for just a moment and look at a non-boat model and how the term pastiche might be useful and how we might work with another type of model that, unlike others that I've focused on today, has archaeological provenance and has been modified as a result of the way that they were transported to Europe. For this, I'm going to return again to Margaret Sertko's research, which traced this granary now in Brussels to the archival photographs for the sediment excavations. Many museums received funerary models from Petrie's sediment excavations that were deconstructed for transport, leading to figures and elements being attached in new places, or the combination of several models that had been sent together. In the case of this granary, 2 crouching rowers from a rowing boat were at one point attached to the roof. As there was an archive photograph of the model prior to it being shipped, which this model has since been matched to, the 2 additional figures have now been removed, and it looks much more like it was in the archival image. It could be argued that if we considered it a pastiche when the rowers were attached, it no longer fits that category. There were many funerary models shipped, jumbled up, and put back together where there are no photographs of how they were at the point at which they were found, or in cases where they are now split over several collections, they're being left as they are. Is it useful to use the word pastiche for these examples? I think it is, as it draws our attention to the history of the funerary model and the spectrum of modifications that they've undergone, as well as the pressures and interpretive frameworks that have had a significant impact on their resulting appearance. While I'm in no way suggesting that pastiches of ancient Egyptian funerary models like that of the Carlos boat should be lauded or strived for, they shouldn't be ignored. Alexander Gatch recently published a pastiche Osiris figure in Prague and suggested that pastiche could be considered a category of object in its own right. Taking from that idea, and by considering pastiche funerary models as their own object category, that of pastiche funerary models and part of the broader category of pastiche ancient Egyptian art, we can critically examine them for what they can say about the ancient objects that were being pastiched and for what they provide in way of commentary of the contemporaneous context of the pastiche's creator. A clear definition of what we mean by pastiche pulls into focus the intentionality of the actions that have caused a pastiche, along with the context, expectations and interpretations of funerary models when they were modified. I believe that applying the term more broadly, including those with archaeological provenance, helps further nuance a spectrum of what is a pastiche. And while I've shown there can be limitations to the questions we can answer surrounding their ancient construction, for example, pastiches are particularly powerful to examine the treatment and interpretations of funerary models over time. They can also act as a mirror for our own interpretations of what a funerary model is and should be. And with that, I'd like to thank you all for listening and also acknowledge several people and organisations listed on the screen. Firstly, the Mellon Foundation for funding this project, the Centre for the Advanced Study in the Visual Arts for my current fellowship, my collaborator Caitlin, our supervisors Melinda, Runa and Renee, and Emory Radiology for CT scanning the boat. The museums listed on the slide allowed me to view their pastiche and not so pastiche models, which was immensely helpful in my research. So thank you again for listening, and I look forward to any questions you may have.
Thank you so much, Emily. It's one of my favourite topics, which I wasn't expecting when I started looking into funerary models. I always saw the ones coming from auction houses and things, and you can see, oh, they've clearly been tampered with, but seeing the stuff that's actually coming from the excavation sites in response to the needs to keep the excavation committees happy. I actually went to Ipswich this week and got to see all the correspondence, which was absolutely fab. They also have the original letter that Hilda Petrie sent out asking the museums to make contributions. And she sells it saying, you get real, genuine, as found in the ground objects. But then they send these repaired ones. So I wondered how you feel about this term pastiche, and you did touch on it briefly, but the level of deception involved. I mean, if something is clearly labelled as this is made up of elements of, but what level of deception do we feel is going on? So, for example, Petrie saying this boat is going to be repaired.
Yeah.
Is that a deliberate way of acknowledging it's made up of pieces from different tombs, or is there a little deception in there?
I think it would be really interesting to look into that and look into the language that's being used at different times, because the term deception is interesting because it's so negative.
Yeah.
I think potentially instead of it being deception, it is more of like maybe a thought process where it's like, why wouldn't you repair? And oh, there's a figure that would fit there perfectly, right? We'll do it.
A lot of the Beni Hassan ones, you still have the tomb number very clearly written on the back of the figure. So you look at it and say, oh, this one's from tomb 34, this one's from tomb 453. So is that a deliberate acknowledgement of the fact that these things, was it not an issue? We just want something aesthetically pretty. The excavation's done. It's really, really interesting. I wondered if you had any thoughts on it.
Yeah, that's an interesting one where you've got very clear. I know of some that are in museums that have been restored in terms of there have been multiple models put together into one for educational purposes. And some of them are very open about the fact that that has happened, and others, you just have to know the material to know that if you've got two different tomb numbers on the back of different figures, you've got a combined model.
Fab, thank you. Tiffany says, this is so fascinating for modern history, as whole jobs of people finding figures and then attaching them for sale for archaeologists. They wonder how many of these things are coming from local people and auction houses versus the archaeologists themselves. And how are current Egyptologists tackling this problem? How are we sorting through the pastiche and ancient examples?
Oh, that's a good question. Knowing who's doing the pastiching is a really interesting one. There are those that are very clear, that are coming from archaeological sites, and I think there's an amazing one at Macclesfield that we both went and saw. which it's known who that's come from and who's done that combining. And what was the second part of the question was sorting through the pastiches.
Through them, yeah.
So that's a really interesting one when it comes to models. There are a number that have even been considered as fakes and are now considered as either pastiches or legitimate ancient models. In particular, there's a really interesting article out of the Australian National Museum, I think it is, where they've got a boat that was thought to be fake, essentially. And they've studied it with similar sort of technical studies, and I think they come down upon the side of they think it's as close to what it would have been as possible. I don't think they come down to say it was a pastiche even. So that's interesting, but it's essentially model by model as well. You have to sort of build up your evidence, and I now get to the point of whenever I see a model, I assume that it's pastiche before I assume that it's not. But that's because of where I'm coming from with the Carlos boat.